When we talk about naming conventions in GameMaker and also in programming at large, what we're talking about is how you choose to name your variables, constants, functions, and in GameMaker how you name your various resources. The idea really is to develop a language for yourself that firstly prevents conflict, so in the case of a player sprite and a player object, they can't both be called just player, right? But also to make it as clear as possible to you and whoever you're working with, or whoever might read your code later, what is what in your code. It should go without saying that you can use whatever naming conventions you like, and your biggest goal should be to be consistent. I struggle with being consistent even across my tutorials over the years. My naming conventions have evolved for various personal reasons, but I figured if you're wondering where to start, I could share what I try to do and why, and maybe that'll be helpful. A tip first of all is that Feather in GameMaker now lets you set these naming conventions, and it will give you helpful reminders if you forget and name something inconsistently. So I'm going to go through what I have set here, mostly through resources at first, then other stuff at the bottom. At the top here is an identifier block list. This is where you can place exceptions, and I'll come back to what I use this for a little later. First of all, with rooms and with all resources, my naming convention is to use a single lowercase letter followed by a meaningful name, starting with a capital letter, and any extra words in the name also have capital letters. So R level 1, for example, for a room, and O player or O monster slime for objects. This style of naming anything is referred to as camel case, where the capital letters are seen as being like camel humps. Strictly, this is lower camel case as the initial part of the name is lower case, and upper camel case will be where the first letter or word is also capitalized. When setting this in Feather, you'll see you can select a bunch of different styles. Now, you'd think based on what I just said, you'd want to select lower camel case for rooms. Our room 1 starts with lowercase r, right? But the naming style you select here ignores whatever you set as a prefix or suffix. So ignoring the lowercase r that I use as a prefix for rooms, the naming style I want to apply is actually upper camel case. Bit weird, but just how it is. Objects work the exact same way. Upper camel and an O prefix, the classic O player for example. In my older tutorials I tend to use obj underscore and rm underscore and so on as prefixes, and I think this is still the most popular style in the GameMaker community. It was at the time, which is why I started with it, but I decided eventually I liked this style instead, as there just aren't that many resources, and why type 3 letters and an underscore when a single letter is just as readable. I find this style to be quicker to type, quicker to read, just looks more pleasant to me, underscores look kinda ugly, and the capital letter draws my eye to what is usually the more pertinent part of the name for me personally. Now, I don't always use one letter, and we can see this in timeline for example. Sometimes there are simply multiple resources with the same starting letter, like tile sets exist for example, and I like to save my limited unique letters for the most important feeling resources. Nobody has ever used a timeline in GameMaker history, so I don't feel like this is particularly important, but in theory, if I used one, it would be named TL whatever. Fonts are an important resource, but the letter F can represent a lot of important things in the world of programming, like floats and functions. While I don't use a F whatever to mean a float or function, I still feel the desire to distinguish fonts somewhat from these concepts, so I went with FN, which you might say still somewhat conflicts with function, I don't know, but it's what I'm used to. Again, all of these are set to upper camel case, although technically lower camel case in practice. Shader starts with an S, but so does sprite, and so does sound. Sprite is the most ubiquitous of the S resources, so it gets the honor of being my single S resource, S player and S crate and S enemy for example. Shader, I use SH. Scripts. Now scripts used to effectively be functions, and I still name scripts and functions in the same manner. Functions being things I want to call as actions in my code, like deal damage or cast spell or draw menu, etc. I try to start with a verb, but I don't always get that right. Here I use no prefix and do true upper camel case. Functions are very important, hence the capitalization and the lack of a prefix. I feel the latter also makes code a bit more intuitive and readable. If my turn equals true, deal damage reads better to me than func deal damage or f deal damage in the same place for example. Again, the most popular approach still names scripts as scr underscore and all lowercase, separating each word with an underscore. For functions, the same but without prefix or with a prefix specific to the script that it's in, but I don't have time for that, both for typing it and reading it, not for me or my brain. Paths. I do very rarely use paths, but I would use PTH track for example. 3 letters is a lot for my style, but again I use these too infrequently to want to use P, and PT my brain wants to read as point, perhaps because of font sizes, so for me I use PTH. Sounds I use SN, again S is taken by sprites. Tile sets I use T, sprites I use S, Animation curve AC, again too niche for me to use A. Constructor function I don't have a rule for, I just name these the same way I name functions. I don't know if other people have a rule they like to use for these, it never really occurred to me to change it, but I guess I can see the logic there. Functions I already talked about with scripts, just upper camel case, no prefix. Does anyone use suffixes, by the way, like for anything? That would just feel weird to me, I can't really picture it. Maybe something I'm forgetting, but I don't know. Macros, now anything that's effectively a constant. So enums2, I use scream case, or all upper as it's referred to here. I just like having a clear reminder of values that are fixed immutable things that are hard compiled into the game. And there's always a feeling that capital letters are hard while lowercase letters are soft, right? As just sort of a tonal thing, so that just feels appropriate. It does mean I have to use underscores to clearly separate words in a name since it's all one case, but it seems worth it here for me. So yeah, same for enum members and enum names, though I keep changing my mind sometimes about enum members, I don't know why. I'll come back to these two in a second and just jump to instance variable names for which I use lower camel case no prefix. We use variables constantly and I don't want to have to prefix them. It also helps separate them out from resources and they can be tons of different types too, so I don't think it makes sense to prefix these. I just want them distinct from functions and from resources, so just lower camel case. Start with a lowercase word and then capitalize the start of each following word just to add readability. Now local variable names I want to distinguish clearly from regular instance variables. These are variables defined with var and they are local to their event or function. I want a style here that emphasizes their more temporary or ephemeral nature, so I add an underscore to the start and then use the same convention as for instance variables. This is extra helpful because it means I'm never going to accidentally conflict with an instance variable with a very similar name that might be in some total other event in the object that I forgot about. Function parameters. So since you use the parameter names in the function themselves in the same scope you would use a local variable and they're color coded the same in GameMaker by default, I use the same naming style for both. Underscore to start, lower camel case. Now there's one exception to this underscore rule of mine for local variables, and that's for iterator variables. And by that I mean the variable you would define for a for loop, often I or j. I just don't like personally having to write that extra underscore for a one letter variable like this if I can help it, and this is the only use case I have for a single letter I or a single letter j. But Feather counts these as local variables and it would complain that I'm not being consistent if I don't add the underscore. But what I can do is use this section at the top I mentioned earlier called the identifier block list to create exception to my rules. By putting variable names in here, separating each full name with a space, you can tell Feather to ignore your rules for these specific variable names. So I just put I and j in here as I don't want them treating the same way as my other local variables. That's basically everything. I think sequences is down there as well. I use sq as a prefix for that, go figure. You get the picture by now. You can go much further than this with your own personal rules and define how explicit and wordy things like your variable names are, how they relate to their specific tasks and scopes and so on, but this is the basics you want to have simple rules for. Again, this is all personal taste and down to you and your team to argue endlessly about. As long as you all use one style, you are good. Even if you don't really, it just makes things annoying and confusing, which makes things slower to make, etc. But you do you. This is just what works for me and my brain, and knowing me, I'll probably have at least one new or different rule by sometime next week. Don't do that, by the way, just stick to your rules as best you can, unless you want to hate reading your old code. I mean, you know, hate it even more. Anyway, hope that was helpful, or at least interesting. Let me know what styles you like to use and why down below. Thanks to all my patrons for funding my work, and thank you for watching all the way to the end. I'll catch you all next time.